London, 1819. Snow whispered against the narrow windows of Whitcombe House, a frail shield between the frigid night and the even colder temperament within. Lady Elinor Whitcombe stood in the dim passage outside the drawing-room, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her as she waited for her stepmother's summons. A low hum of feminine laughter drifted from beyond the door, sharp and gleaming like glass, laughter that excluded her, as it always had since her father's passing. The house, once warm with his good humor, had become a gallery of her diminished place, and tonight its silence pierced more deeply than the January chill. She straightened her posture, willing herself not to tremble, though dread already shivered through her bones. Her stepmother, Mrs. Agatha Whitcombe, swept into the corridor with an expression as smooth and polished as the ice coating the Thames. She carried authority in the rigid line of her shoulders and in the small, satisfied smile that crept across her lips whenever Elinor stood too meekly. "Elinor," she said, as though tasting something bitter, "your presence at the charity gathering is unnecessary and, frankly, unsuitable. His Grace the Duke of Ashford will be among the attendees, and naturally the girls must make their best impressions." Her tone implied that Elinor could offer nothing worth presenting to anyone of consequence. Behind her, the stepsisters, Marianne with her artful curls and Judith with her sharp-edged beauty, emerged wearing gowns chosen for their brilliance under candlelight. Both looked at Elinor with that familiar mixture of pity and triumph, as if they enjoyed reminding her of what she once had and what they now claimed. Marianne smirked. "You understand, of course, dear Elinor. It would hardly do for the Duke to see you in that gown." Judith leaned forward, lowering her voice in faux sympathy. "Truly, we act in kindness. The weather alone would overwhelm you." Elinor met their stares with a calm that required every ounce of restraint. "Father intended that I attend," she said quietly. "He believed the event supported noble causes." The words felt fragile, like porcelain in her mouth. Agatha's eyes flashed. "Your father is no longer here to form opinions. You are under my guardianship now, and I shall determine what is appropriate." Her hand lifted in a gesture that brooked no dissent. "It is settled. You will remain home." A hollow ache opened within Elinor, yet habit made her bow her head. To press further would invite harsher humiliation, and she had endured enough of those to last several lifetimes. As she stepped back, Judith nudged Marianne, and they tittered in triumph. Agatha moved toward the staircase, pausing only to add, "The servants prepared the west sitting-room for your supper. It is quieter there." Quieter, of course, meant forgotten. But the evening's cruelty was not yet complete. As Elinor turned toward the west wing, Marianne caught her arm with deceptive sweetness. "Oh, Elinor, a moment. Stepmama asked us to fetch something from the old storage room before we depart. The lanterns from Father's last autumn festival, remember? Might we trouble you to check that they are still there?" Judith folded her arms, her expression innocent as a cat near cream. "You know the room best." Elinor hesitated. There was no such request. She knew that as plainly as she knew her own name. Yet she also knew that declining would provoke another argument, one that would only feed their delight. "Very well," she murmured. "I shall make sure nothing has been misplaced." The storage room lay at the far end of the servants' corridor, a place where drafts prowled through cracks in the stone and the scent of old wood lingered heavily in the air. She stepped inside and surveyed the crates stacked against the walls. Lanterns were indeed there, but untouched since autumn. Everything seemed in order. She turned to leave, and the door slammed. Her breath halted. She reached for the handle, pulling, twisting, nothing. From the other side came the soft, unmistakable sound of a bolt locking into place. "Marianne?" "Judith." Her voice echoed faintly. No answer, only the hurried patter of slippers retreating down the corridor. A cold prickle crawled up her spine. She pounded the door with her fist. "Let me out. This is not amusing." The silence that answered felt thicker than the shadows gathering around her. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. The single lantern she carried cast only a small circle of gold, though the room seemed to darken with every heartbeat. A creeping numbness settled into her fingers as she pressed them against the icy stone. Her breath misted in the air. She understood their intent now, not as a childish prank but as deliberate obstruction. If she remained trapped, she could not stray near the gathering. If she cried for help, the servants would be too far to hear. They had chosen their moment with precision, their ambitions sharpened by envy. Elinor backed against a crate, sliding down until her skirts pooled around her like fallen petals. She drew her cloak tighter, grounding herself with a whisper of prayer, though her voice shook with exhaustion. Snow sifted through a crack along the window frame, drifting onto the floor like pale confetti. The irony stung. Somewhere, the city prepared for celebration and charity, while she sat forgotten in the darkened bones of her own home. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. At one point, she rose again, attempting to force the door with her shoulder, though pain flared instantly along her arm. She pressed her forehead against the wood, breath thin, strength fading. Her stepmother's triumph, her stepsister's spite, her father's absence, each thought weighed upon her until her vision blurred. She sank to the cold floor, her fingers trembling. "Father," she whispered, "I do not know how much longer I can be the girl you hoped I would become." A sound, faint and unexpected, interrupted the silence. Hoofbeats. Then voices. A knock at the outer door of the estate. Elinor frowned, listening. Another voice, deep, steady, carried through the walls, though she could not make out the words. Moments later, the front doors opened with a gust of winter air. Boots crossed polished floors. Servants murmured in surprise. Then, footsteps in the servants' corridor. She pushed herself upright, dizziness swaying her for a moment. A male voice sounded again, closer now. "I heard someone." Her heart thudded. She tried to call out, but her throat was dry, her voice a frail whisper. She forced her breath, gathering what strength remained. "Here," she managed. "Please, here." Silence followed, then the sudden rattle of the bolt. The door swung open. The lantern light from the hall illuminated him. A tall man in a frost-touched coat, dark hair dampened by melting snow, eyes sharpened with concern. The Duke of Ashford stood framed in the doorway, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to indignation as he took in the sight of her, pale and shivering on the floor. "My lady," he said softly, stepping forward with a command that felt both gentle and irrevocable, "who has done this to you?" Elinor blinked up at him, scarcely trusting that the moment was real. The warmth of his presence felt like the first breath after near drowning. She opened her mouth to answer, yet the room spun, and the strength she had fought to preserve slipped away. She felt his arms catch her, firm yet careful, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. "You are safe," he murmured, steadying her against his chest. "I shall not leave you here." Snow swept into the corridor as he carried her toward the light, and though her vision dimmed, she sensed the change in the air, the first crack in the long night that had defined her life. And somewhere behind them, unseen, the echoes of the locked door seemed to promise that the world beyond it would never be the same again. The morning after the harrowing night seemed to dawn with a strange and fragile stillness, as though the world itself hesitated to disturb Lady Elinor Whitcombe's first hours of safety. Within the spacious guest chamber of Ashford House, sunlight filtered through damask curtains and pale ribbons, touching her face with a gentleness life had recently denied her. For a moment she felt suspended between dream and reality, uncertain whether she truly lay beneath a duke's roof or if her mind merely conjured a pleasant illusion to combat the memory of cold stone walls. But the faint aroma of lavender water, the soft crackling of the fire, and the distant murmur of servants moving with disciplined grace confirmed she had been delivered into a realm wholly different from her suffering. Her breath caught with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, and the emotions stirred within her chest seemed too numerous and too delicate to name. She turned her head slightly, wincing at the remnants of fatigue in her limbs, but her spirit felt subtly fortified, as though some invisible hand had restored the smallest glimmer of her long-lost dignity. Her thoughts drifted to the events that had thrust her here, the chain around the door, the muffled laughter of her stepsisters, and the cold that seeped into her bones until her voice had grown frail with desperation. And then, Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ashford, striding into the darkness like a figure carved from her faintest hopes. She replayed the timbre of his voice, the firm gentleness with which he lifted her from the ground, and the protective anger that burned in his eyes. She had not known a man's outrage could feel like a sanctuary. Now she wondered what might await her in a world where a duke had risked both propriety and reputation to intervene on her behalf. High society was unforgiving, and even noble intentions could unravel into scandalous suppositions. A quiet knock preceded the entry of Mrs. Graythorne, the Duke's trusted housekeeper, carrying a silver tray adorned with a delicate porcelain teacup, a small bowl of broth, and a folded letter. She offered Elinor a warm yet respectful nod, her expression filled with the rare kindness of those who understood hardship. "His Grace sends his compliments and wishes for your swift recovery," the housekeeper said, placing the tray within Elinor's reach. "He has also asked me to deliver this." Atop the tray lay a modest token, a sprig of winter heather bound with a ribbon bearing the Ashford crest. A curious warmth spread through Elinor as she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. Heather, symbol of protection and good fortune. No common trinket, but something selected with intention. Mrs. Graythorne's eyes glimmered with something akin to approval before she excused herself with the quiet efficiency of a woman accustomed to safeguarding household secrets. The letter bore the Duke's handwriting, elegant yet decisive. Elinor broke the seal with cautious anticipation. "Lady Elinor, I trust you are resting comfortably. I request the privilege of speaking with you at your convenience. There are matters concerning your father's estate and last night's events that must be addressed with clarity and haste. Please know that you are among allies here, and no harm shall come to you. A. Hawthorne." The words struck her with force. Allies. It was a simple term, yet meant more to her than any elaborate declaration could. She had lived so long beneath the weight of silent antagonism that even the notion of an ally felt revolutionary. Still, a whisper of apprehension lingered. If the truth of her confinement became known, and how could it not, given the Duke's intervention? Her stepmother would undoubtedly retaliate, and society's eager tongues would spin the tale into something sensational. When Alexander Hawthorne entered later that afternoon, he did so with the deliberate restraint expected of a nobleman, yet there remained a subtle undercurrent in his manner, as though he battled the impulse to approach her with more familiarity than proper. He paused beside her bed, his gaze sweeping over her with careful assessment. "Lady Elinor," he said softly, "it is a relief to see you awake." She attempted to sit upright, but he raised a hand. "Pray, do not strain yourself. Your well-being is of foremost importance." His voice carried the kind of sincerity that lodged itself in the spaces of her heart she had believed long numb. She thanked him with quiet composure, though her gratitude felt far larger than her words. A shadow crossed his features, born not of hesitation but conviction. "I must ask your forgiveness," he said. "I acted last night with more impulsiveness than decorum allows. Yet I do not regret it." The confession was startling in its honesty, and Elinor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Your Grace," she murmured, "you showed me mercy when no one else would. How could I fault you for that?" He inclined his head, though his gaze grew more intense. "Still, there is a reality we must both acknowledge. Word of my arrival at your home has undoubtedly reached the neighboring estates. Our actions, though just, shall be scrutinized." His tone held neither apology nor fear, only awareness. They spoke at length about her stepmother's treatment, the legal ambiguities surrounding the estate, and the Duke's intention to present her account before the county magistrate. Elinor hesitated, fearing the shame that would accompany such revelations, but Hawthorne's steady presence made the decision seem less like a confrontation and more like an act of reclaiming her voice. Yet even as duty dominated their conversation, something unspoken pulsed beneath their exchanges. He listened to her with an attentiveness bordering on reverence, and she found herself unexpectedly drawn to the quiet integrity he carried. She wondered whether he realized how profoundly his belief in her had begun to shape her sense of self. News traveled swiftly among the aristocracy, and as Elinor regained her strength, whispers began to swell like a gathering storm. Servants passing through the halls exchanged discreet glances, conversations in the vestibule ceased abruptly when she approached, and a certain buzzing energy permeated Ashford House. Though the staff was loyal to their Duke, gossip was the lifeblood of society, and the tale of a noblewoman rescued from unlawful confinement by a Duke was too tantalizing to remain contained. Elinor heard fragments: a scandal brewing, the Whitcombe girl, improper circumstances. But instead of shrinking beneath the weight of speculation, she felt an unexpected resilience blooming within her. One evening, as she walked slowly through the conservatory to regain strength in her legs, Hawthorne found her admiring a cluster of early camellias. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow across the blossoms, and for a moment they stood among the fragrant leaves as though suspended outside time. "There are already inquiries from London," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Some express concern. Others—" his jaw tightened, "seek entertainment in misfortune." Elinor traced the edge of a petal, grounding herself. "I expected as much," she replied. "I have been the object of my stepfamily's designs for years. I can endure a few rumors." He stepped closer, studying her with the gravity of a man who rarely misread character. "Endure?" "Yes. But you should not be forced to bear this alone." The statement hung between them, warm and perilous. She lifted her gaze to him, uncertain how to interpret the earnest intensity in his eyes. "Your Grace," she began, "I do not wish to impose upon your reputation," he interrupted with rare tenderness. "You impose nothing. If anything, it is I who risk overstepping. But I cannot stand idle while your name is tossed about by those who know nothing of your fortitude." His words, spoken in the quiet sanctum of the conservatory, were not quite a declaration, yet they trembled on the edge of becoming one. Before she could respond, a footman appeared in the doorway, bowing. "Your Grace, a messenger from London has arrived. The matter is urgent." Hawthorne acknowledged him, though his gaze lingered on Elinor, reluctant to break the moment. "I must attend to this," he said softly. "But Lady Elinor, please trust that whatever storms may gather, I intend to shield you from their full force." As he departed, she watched the sway of the conservatory doors and felt both anticipation and trepidation settle within her. His promise warmed her, yet her fate now hinged upon forces beyond her control: rumors, legal judgments, and the enigmatic intentions of a duke whose presence had already begun to alter the rhythm of her heart. The garden lights flickered as a chill brushed through the glass panes, and in that delicate space between certainty and possibility, Elinor sensed that the world beyond Ashford House was preparing to decide her future. And yet, for the first time, she no longer feared its verdict. The morning after the scandal broke across Ashford, a thin lattice of sunlight filtered through the high windows of the Duke's private study, illuminating the frost that clung stubbornly to the panes. Lady Elinor Whitcombe stood near the hearth, her hands folded before her with a composure that looked practiced, though a faint tremor in her fingers betrayed the disquiet beneath her calm exterior. Alexander Hawthorne watched her intently, noting the steadiness with which she met his gaze, and yet he could sense the strain behind her poise as clearly as if it were written upon her features. She had endured a lifetime of silent indignities, but he knew the newest wave of gossip, malicious, persistent, quick to spread among curious tongues, cut more deeply than any winter chill. The papers had taken liberty with her story, weaving conjecture into fact until the truth was nearly unrecognizable, and each exaggerated detail threatened her already fragile peace. He approached her slowly, mindful of the distance she kept as though uncertain of her welcome despite all he had done to protect her. She had spent days recovering within the estate, surrounded by attendants who treated her with a respect she had long been denied, yet she bore the change with cautious gratitude, too aware of how quickly kindness could shift into cruelty. Alexander sensed her worry that the world saw her as nothing more than the subject of a sensational tale, a woman pitied rather than honored, and it stirred a protective anger he struggled to restrain. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a depth of sincerity that seemed to warm the chilled air between them. He assured her that truth, though slow, would prevail, and that her dignity remained beyond the reach of whispers or ink. Elinor's breath wavered, for she believed him, yet fear still clung to her like a stubborn shadow. She wondered aloud whether the Crown had truly taken interest in her plight or whether it was merely another rumor meant to inflate her story for the public's amusement. Alexander stepped closer, his expression solemn as he explained that the interest was real, prompted not only by her late father's service to the realm but also by the irregularities in the handling of her inheritance. Her stepmother's deceit had reached the ears of ministers who found the matter troubling enough to warrant official investigation. The Crown sought to ensure that her rights, long neglected, were honored fully and without delay. Elinor listened with widening eyes, stunned by the notion that anyone of authority would concern themselves with her well-being after months of being treated as an inconvenience within her own home. She felt something unfamiliar stirring within her, a cautious hope, fragile yet persistent. Alexander then confessed that he had personally delivered the documents to the ministers, unwilling to entrust her future to indifferent couriers or dismissive clerks. His admission struck her with the weight of an unexpected truth, for she realized he had risked considerable reproach by involving himself so directly in her situation. She asked why he had done so, genuinely perplexed, and he paused before answering, searching for words that would neither overwhelm her nor diminish the depth of his feeling. He told her that he admired her courage, her quiet endurance, and the dignity she preserved in the face of cruelty. He could not stand idle while injustice sought to devour her entirely. His voice softened as he spoke, revealing a vulnerability he had long concealed beneath his title, and the sincerity of his confession filled the room with a warmth more powerful than the fire behind her. Elinor felt her composure falter, for his words touched places within her that she had kept armored for years. She admitted in halting tones that kindness unsettled her more than coldness ever had, for cruelty at least was predictable, while affection carried a dangerous potential to disappoint. Alexander listened with unwavering patience, urging her to speak freely, assuring her that he would not recoil from her truth. She revealed that she had been taught to expect nothing, to anticipate neglect, and to accept shadows in place of comfort. Such lessons made it difficult to believe she deserved the protection he offered. His heart ached at her confession, yet he did not interrupt, allowing her voice, quiet, trembling, resolute, to fill the space between them until silence settled like a soft curtain. When he finally spoke, it was with the gentleness of a man who understood the fragility of trust. He told her that she was worthy of far more than the life she had endured, and that no past suffering could diminish the radiance of her character. Her step forward was small, tentative, and yet profoundly significant, for she allowed herself to meet his gaze without the shield of reserve she had held so tightly before. She thanked him, not merely for rescuing her from the storage room, but for seeing her as more than the circumstance of her misfortune. The moment shimmered with quiet intensity, as though the very air recognized the significance of her admission. Alexander felt a shift within himself, a certainty crystallizing around a truth he had resisted naming. He was falling irrevocably in love with her. Before the emotion between them could deepen further, a discreet knock sounded at the study door, drawing them both back into the realm of political consequence. A footman entered with a sealed letter bearing the unmistakable insignia of the crown, its presence commanding instant attention. Alexander accepted the letter with a gravity that mirrored Elinor's sudden tension, for both of them sensed that whatever news it carried would alter her fate irreversibly. As he read the contents in silence, his expression shifted from concern to profound relief, and though her heart raced, she forced herself to wait, hands clasped tightly before her. When he finally looked up, his eyes shone with something fierce and triumphant. The crown had intervened decisively. Her inheritance would be restored in full, her stepmother and stepsisters summoned for formal inquiry, and her rights protected under direct royal authority until all accounts were settled. Elinor exhaled shakily, overwhelmed by the weight of deliverance she had scarcely dared imagine. Alexander stepped toward her, the letter still in hand, and told her that justice, long denied, had finally turned its gaze upon her. She felt tears brighten her vision, not of sorrow but of a release so profound it nearly unsteadied her. When he reached out, a gesture measured, respectful, inviting rather than demanding, she allowed her trembling hand to rest within his. The fire crackled softly, as though bearing witness to a promise forming quietly between them. Their joined hands lingered in the stillness, symbolic of trust cautiously offered and deeply honored. Though uncertainty still loomed beyond the sanctuary of Ashford, she no longer faced it alone, and the knowledge lent her a strength she had never known. Alexander, sensing the significance of her acceptance, tightened his hold with a tenderness that ignited both hope and longing. The moment settled into their hearts like an unspoken vow, fragile yet enduring, and the future, once bleak, opened before them with the first glimmer of possibility. They did not speak further, for words felt inadequate to the quiet understanding blooming between them. Instead they remained near the fire, hands entwined, bound by truth, courage, and the promise of justice newly won. Outside, the winter winds swept across the estate, but within the study an unexpected warmth grew, waiting patiently for the dawn that would soon reshape their lives entirely. The morning that dawned over Ashford House carried with it a peculiar, breathless expectancy, as though the winter air itself understood that the final reckoning between honor and falsehood would at last be settled. Elinor moved through the quiet corridors with a steadiness that had not existed in her only weeks prior. Her steps guided not by fear but by the clarity born of truth now laid bare before the crown's representatives. Letters had been delivered, testimonies gathered, and accounts weighed with a precision that left no space for her stepmother's manufactured grievances. The inquiry's verdict, issued by the Lord Chancellor himself, restored her inheritance, repudiated the accusations against her, and commanded restitution from those who had wronged her. Yet even as justice returned what had once been stripped from her, Elinor understood that the marks of her past would not vanish simply because parchment declared her worthy. It was the quiet resilience she had cultivated in those shadowed days that truly formed the foundation upon which she stood now. She paused near a tall window overlooking the frost-veiled gardens just as Alexander approached, his stride composed, his expression softened by a tenderness he no longer attempted to conceal. He greeted her with a bow that held the ceremonial precision expected of a duke, yet the warmth in his eyes spoke of affections not bound by courtly etiquette. She returned his greeting with equal poise, though her heart quickened at the nearness of him, unsettled still by the certainty with which he had shielded her through every whisper and watchful glance. The Crown's envoys had left only an hour earlier, their verdict already sending subtle ripples through London society. Some of approval, some of chagrin, and many of astonishment that a young woman once dismissed as inconsequential could command such attention from both the law and one of England's most esteemed dukes. Yet even now, as the tumult of judgment seemed to fade like mist from the grounds, Alexander studied her with an introspection that made her pulse catch. She wondered whether he feared she might retreat into solitude now that the storm had passed. Instead, she found herself speaking first, her voice low but resolute, thanking him not for the rescue that others praised but for the quieter choices, the patience, the restraint, the faith in her word when no one else cared to hear it. Alexander listened with a solemnity that made her feel as though each syllable mattered. When at last he responded, he spoke not with the authority of a duke, but with the vulnerability of a man who had watched someone he cherished endure more than any heart should bear. He confessed that her strength had humbled him, that her dignity amid hardship had altered the course of his days, and that he no longer wished to separate his future from hers. Yet he hesitated, allowing silence to settle between them, as if granting her the freedom to turn away should she wish to step beyond the narrative others expected them to follow. Elinor felt the weight of that pause, recognizing the noble restraint in it, and in that moment realized how profoundly her life had shifted. She was no longer a young woman struggling to survive the schemes of her stepfamily, but one standing upon the threshold of a life shaped by her own choosing. She stepped closer, her hands clasped before her, unsure if she possessed the courage to speak the truth pressing against her heart. His eyes encouraged her, not with insistence but with the gentlest invitation. She admitted that what frightened her was not the prospect of admiration from society nor the responsibilities that accompanied becoming a duchess, but the depth of feeling that had grown quietly, steadily, until it compelled her to acknowledge that she cared for him far more deeply than gratitude alone could explain. Her voice faltered, and he instinctively reached out, yet stopped just short of touching her, waiting for her permission. She granted it with a nod so soft it might have been missed had he not been watching her with such devotion. His hand enveloped hers, warm and certain, dissolving the remnants of her fear. He told her then, in words that seemed to echo through the stillness of the corridor, that he wished not only to guard her future but to share it, to build a life marked by sincerity rather than spectacle. She felt the sincerity of that vow resonate through her, awakening a hope she had scarcely allowed herself to imagine. When he asked if she would consent to be his wife, not as an obligation born of scandal, but as a partner chosen with his whole heart, Elinor felt her breath tremble with quiet joy. She accepted with a grace that carried both humility and quiet triumph. Alexander, overcome with emotion he rarely displayed, pressed her hand to his lips in a gesture that felt both reverent and deeply intimate, a promise sealed not by ceremony but by shared truth. Their engagement, once announced, stirred London like a sudden gust through a dormant forest. Some murmured that the union was shockingly swift, others praised the Duke for acting with both justice and compassion. Yet the opinions of society mattered far less to Elinor now than they once had. She had discovered that dignity could survive even the harshest judgment, that love could flourish amid ruin, and that happiness did not require the approval of every gossip-prone tongue. On the morning of their wedding, as soft winter sunlight streamed through the chapel windows, she walked toward Alexander with a serenity that came not from the grandeur around her, but from the certainty that she was finally stepping into the life denied to her for far too long. He met her at the altar with the expression of a man who understood the fragility of joy and therefore valued it all the more. When the vows were spoken and the final blessing given, Alexander lifted her hand in his, guiding her forward into a future no longer overshadowed by fear or shame. As they stepped out of the chapel, the bells ringing with jubilant clarity above them, she felt the air itself lighten, as though the world acknowledged the restoration of her place within it. Her name, once whispered with disdain, was now spoken with admiration, and her story, marked by hardship, resilience, and unexpected devotion, had found its rightful conclusion. Yet even as the cheers of well-wishers echoed across the courtyard, Elinor sensed that her true beginning lay not in the spectacle but in the quiet promise exchanged between two hearts that had endured their own trials to find one another. And when Alexander leaned close, murmuring that he would spend his life ensuring she never again felt alone or silenced, she knew with unwavering certainty that the future awaiting them would be not merely honorable but filled with a happiness she had only dared to dream.